The dust storm that rolled through Marysville, California, that September morning in 1878 wasn't half as threatening as the look in Zachary Pemberton's eyes when he rode up to Zara Emerson's modest homestead with 6 armed men at his back. Zara had been hauling water from the creek when she saw them coming, their horses kicking up clouds of golden dirt that caught the early light. She straightened slowly, setting down the heavy bucket and wiping her hands on her worn canvas trousers. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face calm. She'd been expecting this visit for weeks now, ever since Pemberton had made his first offer to buy her claim, and she'd refused. The land she stood on was small, barely 40 acres, but it was hers. Every inch of it purchased with money she'd saved from years of working as a seamstress in Sacramento, every corner of it filed properly with the land office. When her father died 2 years ago, leaving her alone in the world at 22, she'd made a choice. She wouldn't marry some man who'd control her life and her future. She'd take her inheritance, modest as it was, and claim something of her own. Pemberton dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent his whole life in the saddle. He was 45, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, with the kind of wealth that bought him friends in high places. His ranch stretched for thousands of acres in every direction, swallowing up smaller homesteads like hers whenever their owners got desperate or scared enough to sell. "Miss Emerson," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Fine morning, isn't it?" "It was," Zara replied, not moving from her spot by the creek. "What can I do for you, Mr. Pemberton? I've come to make you another offer." He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. $500 for your property. That's more than fair, considering the condition of your cabin and the fact that you're a woman alone out here. "My cabin is sound, my claim is legal, and my being a woman has nothing to do with the value of my land," Zara said, keeping her voice steady even as anger flared in her chest. "I'm not selling." Pemberton's jaw tightened. "You're being unreasonable. This land is surrounded by my property on 3 sides. The creek that runs through your claim is the only water source for miles. You're disrupting the natural flow of resources that my cattle need." "The creek runs through my land legally," Zara countered. "I have every right to it. And if your cattle need water, they can access it downstream, just like they always have. You're making this difficult, Miss Emerson." Pemberton's voice dropped lower, taking on a harder edge. "I'm trying to be generous here, but there are other ways to convince stubborn people to see reason." One of the men behind him, a scarred ranch hand named Dutch, let his hand rest obviously on the pistol at his hip. The threat was clear. Zara felt ice slide down her spine, but she didn't let it show. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Pemberton?" "Because I should tell you that I've documented every one of these visits with the sheriff in town. If anything happens to me or my property, he'll know exactly where to look." It was a bluff. Sheriff Morrison was in Pemberton's pocket. Everyone knew it. But Pemberton didn't know whether she'd written to authorities in Sacramento, and that uncertainty was the only weapon she had. "You're making a mistake," Pemberton said softly. "A woman alone out here, anything could happen. Accidents, bandits, wild animals. It's dangerous country for someone without protection." "I'll take my chances," Zara said, meeting his eyes without flinching. For a long moment, the two of them stared at each other, the morning air thick with tension. Then Pemberton folded the paper back into his pocket with deliberate slowness. "We'll see how long your stubbornness lasts," he said, swinging back into his saddle. "Winter's coming, Miss Emerson. This valley gets mighty cold when the snow starts falling, mighty lonely too." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following in a cloud of dust. Zara stood frozen until they disappeared over the rise. Then her knees went weak, and she sat down hard on the creek bank. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. She'd known it would come to this eventually. Pemberton wanted her gone, wanted her water rights and her land to complete his empire. He'd driven off 3 other small homesteaders in the past year alone. One had left after his barn mysteriously burned down. Another found his cattle dead from poisoned water. The third, an old prospector, simply disappeared one night, and no one asked too many questions. Zara looked at her cabin, at the vegetable garden she'd coaxed from the stubborn California soil, at the small corral where her 2 horses stood watching her with calm eyes. This was everything she had. Everything she'd worked for. She couldn't just walk away, but she also couldn't fight Pemberton and his hired guns alone. The sound of hoofbeats made her jump, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle she'd left leaning against the cabin wall 15 feet away. But the rider who came over the eastern rise wasn't one of Pemberton's men. This was a single cowboy on a paint horse, leading a pack mule behind him. He was tall, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled just past his collar beneath his wide-brimmed hat. As he drew closer, she could see he was young, probably around her own age, with sun-bronzed skin and startlingly blue eyes that stood out against his tanned face. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent his entire life on horseback, but there was something different about him compared to Pemberton's hard-eyed ranch hands. Something gentler in the way he sat his horse, in the way he looked at the land around him. He stopped a respectful distance from her cabin and dismounted, keeping his hands visible and away from the gun at his hip. "Morning, madam," he called out, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "I hope I'm not intruding. I'm James Foster. I've filed a claim on the property just east of here, the old Morrison place. Thought I should introduce myself to my neighbor." Zara stood up slowly, brushing dust from her trousers. She'd heard that someone had purchased the abandoned homestead on her eastern border, but she hadn't expected them to arrive so soon. "Zara Emerson," she said, walking closer but still maintaining a cautious distance. "Welcome to the valley, I suppose." James Foster smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more open. "Thank you. I came out from Texas looking for a fresh start. Got the papers all legal and proper, but I wanted to make sure there weren't any boundary disputes or issues with the previous owner that might cause trouble." "The previous owner died last winter," Zara said. "No family came forward to claim it, so it went back to the land office." "Your claim should be clear. That's good to know." He glanced back toward the western ridge where Pemberton had disappeared. Those men who just rode out of here, they didn't look too friendly. "Everything all right?" Zara hesitated. She didn't know this man, didn't know if she could trust him. He might be exactly what he appeared to be, an honest homesteader looking for land of his own. Or he might be one of Pemberton's men, planted here to watch her or intimidate her from another direction. "Just a neighbor," she said carefully, "making an offer on my land. You selling?" James asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice, no pressure or judgment. "No," Zara said firmly. "This is my home." James nodded slowly, his blue eyes studying her face. "Good, land is precious. A person's got a right to hold onto what's theirs." He paused, then added, "Though I couldn't help but notice those men were armed pretty heavy for a simple business visit." So he'd been watching. Zara wasn't sure if that made her feel safer or more threatened. "Things can get complicated in land disputes," she said neutrally. "I expect they can." James looked back at his pack mule, then at the sun climbing higher in the sky. "Well, I won't keep you from your work, Miss Emerson. I just wanted to introduce myself proper. If you need anything, I'll be just over the ridge, building myself a cabin before the weather turns." "You're planning to build before winter?" Zara couldn't help the note of surprise in her voice. That's not much time. I've got a strong back and good hands, James said with another of those easy smiles. And I've built a cabin or two before. I'll manage. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture that seemed genuinely respectful rather than mocking like Pemberton's had been, and swung back into his saddle. Zara watched him ride away, her mind churning with questions. The timing of his arrival seemed almost too convenient, right after Pemberton's threatening visit. But something about the way he'd looked at her, spoken to her, seemed honest. She'd have to wait and see. Over the next few days, Zara found herself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement around her property. She half expected Pemberton's men to return in the night, to burn her crops or scatter her horses. But nothing happened. The valley remained quiet except for the usual sounds of birds and wind, and the creek running over stones. On the third morning, she was mending the fence around her corral when she heard the rhythmic sound of an axe biting into wood. It carried clearly across the short distance from the Morrison property, a steady, strong rhythm that continued for hours. James Foster was making good on his promise to build. Curiosity got the better of her that afternoon. She saddled her mare, a patient gray named Silver, and rode over the low ridge that separated her land from his. What she found surprised her. James had already cleared a level space and marked out the foundation for a cabin. He'd felled half a dozen young pines and was in the process of trimming them into logs, his shirt discarded in the afternoon heat, sweat gleaming on his shoulders and back. The muscles in his arms flexed with each swing of the axe, and she found herself staring for a moment before she mentally shook herself and cleared her throat. He spun around, reaching for his gun, then relaxed when he saw her. "Miss Emerson," he said, breathing hard from his work. He grabbed his shirt and pulled it back on, though it stuck to his damp skin. "Didn't hear you ride up. Everything all right?" "I heard the axe work," Zara said, dismounting. "Thought I'd see how the building was coming along. You've made good progress." "I've had practice," James said, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "Helped my daddy build 2 cabins back in Texas before I struck out on my own. The trick is getting the foundation level and the logs fitted tight. Keep the wind out in winter." Zara walked around the marked-out space, noting the careful measurements, the way he'd positioned it to take advantage of a natural windbreak from the hills to the north. "You've chosen a good spot," she said. "The drainage will keep you from flooding in spring." "That's what I figured." James leaned on his axe, watching her. "You know land pretty well for someone who hasn't been homesteading long." "For a woman, you mean," Zara said dryly. He had the grace to look embarrassed. "I didn't mean any offense, none taken. But you're right, I haven't been out here long." "Just over a year. I learned everything I could before I filed my claim, though. Read every book about farming and ranching I could get my hands on. Talked to everyone who'd listen. I wasn't going to come out here ignorant." "Smart," James said, and it sounded like he meant it. Most folks, men included, file claims with no idea what they're getting into. Then they starve or freeze or give up and head back to the city. "I won't give up," Zara said quietly. Something in her tone made James look at her more closely. "That man who came to visit you, the one with all the hired guns, he's trying to run you off, isn't he?" Zara debated lying, then decided against it. If James Foster was really settling in as her neighbor, he'd figure it out soon enough anyway. "His name is Zachary Pemberton. He owns most of the land in this valley. He wants mine because it has water rights to the creek." "And you're not selling?" "No," James nodded slowly. "Can't say I blame you. It's good land, worth fighting for." He paused, then asked, "Has he made trouble for you beyond trying to buy you out?" "Not yet," Zara said, "but he's driven off other small homesteaders, Burned barns, poisoned cattle, worse things that people whisper about but can't prove. And the law, sheriffs in his pocket. Zara wrapped her arms around herself despite the afternoon warmth. I've thought about writing to Sacramento, but by the time anyone came to investigate, it might be too late. James was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he said, "Well, you're not alone out here anymore. I'm your neighbor now. That means something where I come from." Neighbors look out for each other. Zara felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying for weeks. "I appreciate that, Mr. Foster, but I don't want to drag you into trouble. Pemberton is powerful and he's not afraid to use violence." "Neither am I if it comes to it," James said, and there was steel beneath the easy drawl in his voice. "Though I generally prefer to solve problems without bloodshed. But a man or a woman has a right to defend what's theirs. That's not trouble, Miss Emerson. That's justice." Something about the way he said it, the quiet conviction in his voice, made Zara believe him. "Call me Zara," she said. "If we're going to be neighbors, we might as well use first names." "Zara," he repeated, and she liked the way it sounded in his accent. "Then you'd better call me James." "All right, James." She glanced at the sun, noting its position. "I should get back. I've got my own work to do." "Before you go," James said, "would you do me the honor of advising me on my cabin layout? I've got a good sense of building, but you know this land better than I do. If there's something I'm missing about weather patterns or soil conditions, I'd rather know now before I get too far along." It was a smart question, and Zara found herself warming to him even more. A lot of men wouldn't have asked for her opinion, would have assumed they knew better. She spent the next half hour walking the site with him, pointing out where the prevailing winds came from in winter, where snow tended to drift, where the spring runoff would be heaviest. James listened carefully, asking intelligent questions, and adjusted his plans based on her observations. When she finally rode back to her own property, Zara felt lighter than she had in weeks. Having another person nearby, someone who didn't seem to want to drive her away or control her, made the valley feel less lonely. And if she also found herself thinking about the strength in James Foster's shoulders, the warmth in his blue eyes, well, that was nobody's business but her own. The next week passed in relative peace. Zara fell into her routine of tending her garden, caring for her horses, making small repairs and improvements to her cabin and fences. Each day she could hear James working on his property, the sound of hammering and sawing a constant background presence that felt oddly comforting. On the 8th day, she was hanging laundry when a rider approached from town. She tensed, but it was just young Billy Chen, who sometimes ran errands for the general store. He was 15, the son of Chinese immigrants who ran a restaurant in Marysville, and one of the few people in town who'd been kind to her without expectation or judgment. "Miss Emerson," he called, sliding off his horse with the awkward energy of a boy still growing into his height. "Mr. Patterson at the store asked me to bring you this." He held out a letter. Zara took it with surprise. She rarely got mail. The return address made her frown. It was from a lawyer's office in Sacramento. She tipped Billy a coin for his trouble and waited until he'd ridden off before opening it. The letter's contents made her blood run cold. According to the attorney, Zachary Pemberton had filed a legal challenge to her water rights, claiming that the creek running through her property was historically part of his ranch's water allocation, and that her diversion of it for her own use was illegal. There was going to be a hearing in Sacramento in 6 weeks, and she was required to appear with all her documentation proving her legal claim to the water. Zara sank down on her cabin steps, the letter shaking in her hands. She had her land deed, her claim papers, everything filed properly. But Pemberton had money for expensive lawyers and connections in the territorial government. If he could tie her up in legal battles long enough, drain her small savings on legal fees and travel expenses, he might not need to drive her off violently. He could bankrupt her instead. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear splashed on the letter, smudging the ink. She wiped her face angrily. She wouldn't let Pemberton see her break. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Zara." She looked up to find James standing a few yards away, his hat in his hands. He must have walked over instead of riding because she hadn't heard him approach. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I saw the messenger leave and then you sat down and, well, I wanted to make sure you were all right, but I can go if you'd rather be alone." Zara shook her head. She was tired of being alone, tired of carrying all this weight by herself. "Pemberton's filed a legal challenge to my water rights," she said, her voice rough. "He's taking me to court in Sacramento. Even if I win, the legal fees alone might force me to sell just to survive." James's jaw tightened. He came up the steps and sat down beside her, not too close, respecting her space but offering his presence. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the letter. She handed it to him and watched while he read through it carefully. "This is weak," he said after a moment. "The claims he's making don't have legal standing if your deed includes water rights, which it should if you filed properly." "It does," Zara said. "I made sure of it, but he has better lawyers than I could ever afford." "Maybe," James said. "But legal and right aren't always the same thing as expensive and connected." He looked at her, his blue eyes serious. "My older brother is a lawyer in San Francisco, a good one. He handles cases for small ranchers and farmers against big land companies. Let me write to him, see if he can help or at least recommend someone who won't charge you everything you have." "I can't ask you to do that," Zara protested. "You barely know me." "You're not asking," James said firmly. "I'm offering. And as for barely knowing you, well, that's something we can fix. I've got a good sense about people, Zara. I can tell you're honest and hardworking and that you've got a right to keep what's yours. That's enough for me." Zara looked at him, at the sincerity in his face, and felt something shift in her chest. She'd been alone for so long, fighting for everything by herself, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone in her corner. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how I'll repay you." "No repayment needed," James said. "That's what neighbors do." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though if you wanted to share your knowledge of making bread sometime, I wouldn't say no. My attempts at baking have been, well, unfortunate." Despite everything, Zara found herself laughing. "Your bread can't be that bad. I managed to make something that my horse wouldn't even eat," James said seriously. "It had the consistency of a rock and about the same taste." "That is unfortunate," Zara agreed, still smiling. "All right, I'll teach you to make bread that's actually edible." "It's the least I can do. It's a deal." James stood up, handing the letter back to her. "I'll write to my brother tonight and send it out with the morning stage. In the meantime, you gather all your documentation, everything that proves your claim and your water rights. We'll make sure you're prepared for this fight." After he left, Zara sat for a while longer, watching the sun move across the sky. For the first time since Pemberton had started pressuring her, she didn't feel quite so helpless. She had an ally now, maybe even a friend. The thought warmed her more than it should have. Over the next 2 weeks, Zara and James fell into an easy companionship. He helped her repair a weak section of her corral fence, his carpentry skills evident in the strong, straight work. She brought over a basket of vegetables from her garden and showed him how to make a decent loaf of bread, laughing at his first clumsy attempts to knead the dough. "It's not supposed to fight back," she teased, watching him wrestle with the sticky mass. "Tell that to the bread," James grumbled, but he was grinning. I think it's got a personal vendetta against me. You're using too much flour, Zara said, moving to stand beside him at the rough table he'd constructed outside his half-finished cabin. Here, like this. She put her hands over his, guiding his movements. Gentle but firm. You want to work it, not punish it. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his skin under hers, the strength in his hands, the way he smelled of pine sap and honest sweat. When she looked up, she found him watching her instead of the bread, something soft and wondering in his expression. "Like this?" he asked, his voice lower than before. "Yes," Zara managed, her mouth suddenly dry. "Just like that." They stood there for a moment too long, hands entwined in bread dough, before Zara stepped back quickly. "You've got it now," she said, brushing flour from her skirt. "Just let it rise for an hour, then bake it. You should have something edible." "Thank you," James said, and she wasn't entirely sure he was just talking about the bread. A letter came from James's brother 3 days later. Connor Foster wrote that he'd be happy to represent Zara, and that from what James had described, Pemberton's legal challenge was built on shaky ground. More importantly, Connor knew the judge who'd be hearing the case, and while the man could be influenced by money and connections, he had a reputation for fairness when presented with clear documentation. Connor would meet them in Sacramento the day before the hearing to review everything and prepare their case. "He's not even charging you," James said, showing Zara the letter. "Says it's a favor to me, and besides, he hates seeing big landowners bully small farmers." "I still want to pay him something," Zara insisted. "It's not right to take charity." "It's not charity, it's family helping family," James said, then seemed to realize what he'd said. "I mean, you're my neighbor and Connor's my brother, so in a way that's almost like family." He looked embarrassed, rubbing the back of his neck. Zara felt her cheeks warm. "I understand what you meant, and I'm grateful, to both of you." That evening, she invited James over for a proper dinner to celebrate the good news. She made chicken stew with vegetables from her garden, and he brought over one of his successful bread loaves, along with a jar of honey he'd traded for in town. They ate at her small table, the lamp casting warm light over the rough wooden walls of her cabin. It was simple and sparse, but she'd made it comfortable with curtains she'd sewn herself and a colorful quilt her mother had made before she died. "You've made this place into a real home," James said, looking around. "It's got a good feeling to it." "Thank you," Zara said. "It's the first place that's ever been truly mine. Everything in here I either made, bought, or built with my own hands. There's something powerful in that." "I understand," James said quietly. "That's why I left Texas. My daddy wanted me to work his ranch, follow in his footsteps. It's a good ranch and he's a good man, but it would never have been mine. Always would have been his. I needed something of my own to build." "Why California?" Zara asked, genuinely curious. "Always wanted to see the ocean," James admitted with a sheepish smile. "Sounds silly, I know. But I grew up on flat prairie land, nothing but grass and sky for miles. The idea of all that water stretching out to the horizon, something about it called to me. Figured I'd come west, find some land and be close enough to visit the coast when I wanted." "It's not silly," Zara said. "I've seen the ocean. Went to San Francisco once before my father died. It's breathtaking, terrifying and beautiful all at once." They talked long into the evening, sharing stories of their lives, their dreams, their fears. Zara found herself opening up to James in ways she rarely did with anyone, telling him about her father's death, about her decision to strike out alone, about the loneliness and fear that sometimes kept her awake at night wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. "You didn't make a mistake," James said firmly. "What you're doing takes courage. Real courage, the kind that matters. Standing up for yourself, building something from nothing, refusing to let anyone tell you what you can't do because you're a woman. That's not a mistake. That's admirable." His words settled into her chest, warm and reassuring. She'd needed to hear that more than she'd realized. When James finally stood to leave, thanking her for the dinner and the company, Zara walked him to the door. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds spilled on black velvet. "Zara," James said, turning to face her, "I want you to know, whatever happens with this court case with Pemberton, you're not alone in this. I meant what I said about neighbors looking out for each other. But it's more than that now. I consider you a friend, a good friend." "I consider you the same," Zara said softly, and realized it was true. In just a few weeks, James Foster had become one of the most important people in her life. He smiled, that warm smile that transformed his whole face, and tipped his hat to her. "Good night, Zara." "Good night, James." She watched him walk back toward his property, his figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. When she finally went back inside, her cabin felt less lonely than it had in a long time. The peace lasted another week. Then Pemberton made his next move. Zara was in her garden early one morning, pulling weeds in the cool dawn air, when she heard her horses screaming. She ran toward the corral, her heart pounding, and found chaos. Someone had cut her fence during the night and her horses were gone. Worse, they'd left a dead coyote in the middle of the corral, its throat cut, blood pooling in the dirt. It was a message. A threat. Zara stood frozen, staring at the dead animal, fighting down nausea and rage in equal measure. This was Pemberton's work. She was certain of it. He was escalating, trying to scare her into giving up before the court case could even happen. "Zara," James's voice called from across the ridge. He must have heard the horses screaming too. He came running, vaulting over the fence line with athletic grace, then stopped short when he saw the corral. "God in heaven," he breathed. "When did this happen?" "Last night, I think," Zara said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the anger shaking through her. "I checked on them at sunset and everything was fine. They cut the fence and chased them off." James walked around the corral, studying the cut fence, the hoof prints, the disturbing placement of the coyote. His face was grim. This was professional, someone who knew what they were doing. "Pemberton's ranch hands," Zara said flatly, "probably." James looked at her, his blue eyes fierce. "We need to report this to the sheriff." "He won't do anything," Zara protested. "I told you, he's in Pemberton's pocket." "Maybe so, but we need it on record. If this goes to court, if it comes down to proving harassment and intimidation, we need documentation." James put a hand on her shoulder, a steadying presence. "We'll go into town together, file a report. Then we'll track down your horses. They can't have gone far." The ride into Marysville was tense and silent. Zara kept scanning the hills around them, half expecting an ambush, but nothing happened. The town was just waking up when they arrived. Shopkeepers opening their doors. The saloon emptying out the last of the overnight gamblers. Sheriff Morrison was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a thick mustache and calculating eyes. He listened to Zara's report with obvious disinterest, making cursory notes. "I'll look into it," he said in a tone that suggested he'd do no such thing. Could have been anyone, though. Rustlers, drifters passing through. Cutting fence and stealing horses ain't exactly unusual out here. "They didn't steal the horses," James said, his voice hard. "They scattered them, and they left a dead coyote as a warning. That's not rustling, Sheriff. That's intimidation." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "And you are James Foster." "I filed a claim on the Morrison property east of Miss Emerson's land. I'm her neighbor." "I see." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "You making accusations against someone specific, Mr. Foster?" "We're reporting a crime," James said evenly. What you do with that information is your job as sheriff. But I want it noted that Miss Emerson has been threatened and harassed, and if anything else happens to her or her property, there will be consequences. That sounds like a threat, Morrison said. It's a promise, James replied. Legal consequences. We'll take this all the way to the territorial governor if we have to. Morrison's face darkened, but he couldn't argue with that. Reports filed, he said shortly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do. Outside the sheriff's office, Zara let out a shaky breath. That was a waste of time. Maybe, James said. But now it's documented. Come on, let's get supplies and then track down your horses. They found Silver and the other horse, a brown gelding named Copper, about 3 miles northwest, grazing peacefully in a small valley. It took most of the morning to catch them and lead them back to Zara's property. By the time they had the fence repaired and the horses secured again, it was past noon, and they were both exhausted. Thank you, Zara said as they stood by the corral, checking their repair work. I couldn't have done this without you. Yes, you could have, James said. You would have figured it out, but I'm glad I could help. He paused, looking at her cabin, then at his own unfinished one across the ridge. Zara, I don't like the idea of you being out here alone at night, not with Pemberton escalating like this. Would you consider letting me camp out closer to your property, just until this legal matter is settled and things calm down? Zara's first instinct was to refuse, to insist she could take care of herself. But that was pride talking, and pride could get her killed. All right, she said, but not too close. I don't want people getting the wrong idea. You can set up camp on the ridge between our properties. You'll be able to see both places from there. That'll work, James agreed. I'll move my things over tonight. True to his word, James set up a tidy camp on the ridge that evening. Zara could see his campfire from her cabin window, a small point of light in the darkness. It should have felt intrusive, having someone watching over her like that. Instead, it felt safe. The next few days passed without incident. James worked on his cabin during the day, always within earshot of Zara's property. In the evenings, they often shared meals, taking turns cooking and swapping stories. Zara found herself looking forward to those evenings more and more, to the sound of James's laugh, to the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, to the comfortable silences that fell between them. She was falling for him. The realization hit her one evening as she watched him demonstrate a rope trick he'd learned as a boy in Texas, his movements graceful and sure. She was falling for James Foster, this cowboy who'd appeared in her life at exactly the moment she needed someone most. The thought terrified her. She'd sworn she wouldn't let herself depend on a man, wouldn't give anyone that kind of power over her life and her future. But this didn't feel like dependence. It felt like partnership, like friendship deepening into something more. You're quiet tonight, James said, coiling his rope and sitting down beside her on the cabin steps. Everything all right, just thinking, Zara said. About what happens after the court case. If I win, Pemberton might get more aggressive. If I lose, I'll have to sell anyway. Either way, the future feels uncertain. Life's always uncertain, James said. That's what makes it interesting. He looked at her, his expression serious. But whatever happens, you won't face it alone. I meant what I said, Zara. I'm here for the long haul. Why? The question burst out before she could stop it. You barely know me, James. You could have just built your cabin and minded your own business. Why are you putting yourself at risk for me? James was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and honest. Because from the moment I saw you standing by that creek, facing down Pemberton and his hired guns with your chin up and your back straight, I knew you were someone special, someone worth knowing, worth helping, worth. He trailed off, then met her eyes. Worth caring about. Zara's heart hammered in her chest. James. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I know you value your independence and I respect that. I'm just telling you the truth. You've become important to me, Zara. Your well-being matters to me, and I'll help you fight for your land and your rights because it's the right thing to do, but also because I care about you. As a friend, as a neighbor, as whatever you'll let me be. Zara looked at him, at this honest, decent man who'd walked into her life and turned it upside down in the best possible way. She thought about all her plans to stay independent, to never rely on anyone. But what James was offering wasn't control or dependence. It was partnership, support, maybe even love. You've become important to me too, she said softly. More than I expected, more than I thought I'd allow. James's face lit up with a smile that made her breath catch. Yeah, she confirmed and found herself smiling back. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, James reached over and took her hand. His palm was calloused from work, warm and strong. Zara laced her fingers through his, and they sat there on the cabin steps as night fell around them, holding hands and watching the stars. Both of them understanding that something fundamental had shifted between them. The morning they were supposed to leave for Sacramento, Zara woke to find smoke on the horizon. She ran outside, her heart in her throat, and saw orange flames licking at the sky from the direction of James's property. She didn't think, just grabbed a bucket and started running. By the time she reached his cabin, James was already there, desperately trying to save the structure. His supply shed was fully engulfed, flames consuming the lumber and tools he'd stored there. The cabin itself was in danger, sparks landing on the roof. The creek. Zara shouted over the roar of the fire. We need to form a water line. They worked frantically, hauling bucket after bucket from the creek, throwing water on the cabin roof to keep it from catching. The shed was a lost cause, but they might be able to save the cabin itself. Smoke stung Zara's eyes and lungs, her arms screaming with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they got the fire under control. The shed was reduced to charred timbers and ash, but the cabin had survived with only minor damage to one corner of the roof. They collapsed on the ground, both of them covered in soot and ash, coughing and exhausted. Pemberton, James said when he could speak. Had to be. This is too convenient, right before we're supposed to leave for Sacramento. We should still go, Zara said. We can't let him think this worked. James looked at the ruins of his shed, at the damaged cabin, and his jaw tightened. You're right, we'll go. But first we're riding into town and reporting this, same as we did with your horses. Sheriff Morrison was even less interested in this report than the last one. Fires happen, he said with a shrug. Especially with men living rough doing building work, probably just a spark from your campfire. I didn't have a campfire last night, James said coldly. I was staying at Miss Emerson's property, remember? As protection, since her property was vandalized, the fire had to have been set deliberately. Can you prove that? Morrison asked. Can you prove it wasn't? James shot back. The two men stared at each other, tension crackling between them. Finally, Morrison said, Reports filed. Now get out of my office. They left Marysville later that morning, taking the stage to Sacramento. The journey would take 2 days of hard travel, bouncing along rutted roads and changing horses at way stations. They'd have to stay overnight in Sacramento before the hearing, which meant paying for hotel rooms they could barely afford. But none of that mattered as much as the principle of the thing. Zara wouldn't let Pemberton win. On the stage, sitting close together as it rocked and swayed, James took her hand again. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together, he said quietly. Together, Zara echoed and squeezed his hand. Sacramento was a bustling city, so different from the quiet valley they'd left behind. The streets were crowded with wagons and riders, the wooden sidewalks full of men in business suits and women in elaborate dresses. The buildings were tall and grand compared to Marysville's simple structures, painted in bright colors and decorated with ornate signs. They found a modest hotel near the courthouse and took separate rooms, mindful of propriety even as Zara wished they didn't have to part, even for a night. She felt safer when James was nearby. Connor Foster arrived at their hotel that evening. He was taller than James, broader in the shoulders, with the same blue eyes but darker hair going gray at the temples. He had the confident bearing of a successful lawyer and the warm smile of a kind man. "Little brother," he said, pulling James into a hug, "good to see you. You look more like a proper frontiersman every time I see you." "And you look more like a city dandy," James replied, but he was grinning. "Thanks for coming, Connor. It means a lot. Wouldn't miss it." Connor turned to Zara and bowed slightly. "Miss Emerson, it's a pleasure to meet you. James wrote very highly of you in his letters." Zara felt her cheeks warm. "He did?" "Oh yes," Connor said, his eyes twinkling. "Quite enthusiastically, in fact, but let's talk about your case." "James, you were right in your assessment. Pemberton's legal challenge is weak. He's trying to claim historical water rights that predate the current land surveys, but that won't hold up if your deed explicitly includes creek access, which according to the documents you sent, it does." They spent the next 2 hours going over every detail, every document, preparing for the hearing. Connor asked sharp questions, anticipated the arguments Pemberton's lawyers might make, and built their counter-arguments with careful precision. "The key is going to be demonstrating that Pemberton is using the legal system to harass you out of legitimate land ownership," Connor explained. "If we can show a pattern of intimidation and prove that his water rights claims are spurious, Judge Hawthorne will rule in your favor. He doesn't like people abusing the courts to bully small farmers. What if Pemberton's lawyers are better at arguing than I am at defending myself?" Zara asked nervously. "They won't be arguing against you," Connor said with a smile. "They'll be arguing against me. And I promise you, I'm very good at my job." The hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Zara barely slept that night, anxiety churning in her stomach. She kept thinking about everything she could lose if this went wrong: her land, her home, her independence, her future. There was a soft knock on her door around midnight. When she opened it, James was standing there in his shirt sleeves, looking as restless as she felt. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "No," Zara admitted. "Want to go for a walk? The city's still lively this time of night. Might help calm our nerves." They walked through Sacramento's gas-lit streets, past saloons spilling music and laughter into the night, past shops closed until morning, past the grand buildings that housed California's government. James kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling her stories about his childhood in Texas, about his family, about anything and everything to distract her from tomorrow's hearing. Eventually, they found themselves on a quiet street overlooking the Sacramento River, the water dark and smooth under the moonlight. "James," Zara said quietly, "if this doesn't go well tomorrow, if I lose my land, I want you to know how much your help has meant to me. Your friendship, your support, everything. It's made an impossible situation bearable." "You're not going to lose," James said firmly. "Connor knows what he's doing. But even if somehow things go wrong, you'll rebuild. You're strong enough to handle whatever comes." "I don't always feel strong," Zara confessed. "Sometimes I feel terrified and overwhelmed and in over my head." "That's not weakness," James said, turning to face her. "That's human. Real strength isn't never being afraid, Zara. It's being afraid and doing the hard thing anyway. You've done that every day since you filed your claim. That takes more courage than most people have." Zara looked up at him, at his honest face in the moonlight, and felt something settle in her chest. She'd been so focused on staying independent, on not needing anyone, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen by another person. James saw her, all of her, the fear and the strength, the determination and the doubt, and he valued her anyway. "James," she said softly, "I think I'm falling in love with you." His eyes widened, then softened. "Zara, I know I'm falling in love with you. I think I started the day I saw you standing up to Pemberton, and I haven't stopped since." He cupped her face in his hands, gentle and reverent, and kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, asking permission. Zara answered by wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back with all the emotion she'd been holding inside. He tasted like coffee and possibility, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she felt like everything had changed. "Whatever happens tomorrow," James said, resting his forehead against hers, "we'll face it together. And when this is over, when your land is secure and Pemberton is defeated, I want to court you properly, with flowers and dinners and all the romance you deserve. I want to build my future next to yours if you'll have me." "I'll have you," Zara whispered. "I want that too, all of it." They kissed again, longer this time, and Zara felt hope bloom in her chest for the first time in weeks. Whatever tomorrow brought, she wouldn't face it alone. The courtroom was packed when they arrived the next morning. Pemberton was there with 3 expensive-looking lawyers, their suits perfectly tailored, their expressions confident. Pemberton himself sat at the plaintiff's table looking smug and self-assured. When he saw Zara enter with James and Connor, his expression flickered with something like surprise, then hardened into anger. He hadn't expected her to have legal representation, especially not someone as skilled as Connor Foster. Judge Hawthorne was a stern-looking man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He called the court to order and listened as Pemberton's lead lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Alastair Duncan, laid out their case. Duncan claimed that the creek running through Zara's property had historically been part of the Pemberton Ranch's water allocation, dating back to Spanish land grants from before California's statehood. He argued that Zara's use of the water was infringing on established rights and causing damage to Pemberton's cattle operation. It was all lies, but Duncan presented it with such confidence that Zara felt her stomach sink. He had maps, documents, testimony from other ranchers. It looked overwhelming. Then Connor stood up. "Your Honor," he said in a clear, carrying voice, "the plaintiff's case is built on a foundation of historical claims that don't withstand scrutiny. The Spanish land grants Mr. Duncan referenced didn't include specific water rights to the creek in question. Those water allocations were tied to different watersheds entirely, as documented in the Territorial Survey of 1868. He produced his own maps, his own documents, all carefully organized and labeled. He walked the judge through the survey records, through the land office filings, through the clear chain of title that showed Zara's water rights were legitimate and legally sound. Then he brought up the harassment. "Your Honor, this case isn't really about water rights at all. It's about a powerful landowner trying to use the legal system to intimidate a small homesteader into abandoning legally owned property. Miss Emerson has been subjected to threats, vandalism, and intimidation. Her horses were stolen and her fences cut. Her neighbor's property was burned. All of this coincidentally happening after she refused to sell her land to Mr. Pemberton." Duncan objected loudly, claiming that Connor was making unfounded accusations. But Connor calmly produced the sheriff's reports they'd filed, documenting each incident. "The timing is suspicious," Your Honor, Connor continued, Mr. Pemberton makes offers to buy Miss Emerson's land. She refuses. Suddenly, she's facing legal challenges and property damage. This is a pattern of harassment designed to force her off her claim through intimidation when legal purchase failed. Judge Hawthorne's expression grew increasingly stern as the hearing progressed. He asked pointed questions of both sides, examined all the documents carefully, and listened to testimony from the land office clerk who'd processed Zara's original claim. Finally, after nearly 3 hours, he called for a recess to review the evidence. The wait was agonizing. Zara sat between James and Connor, her hands clasped tight in her lap, trying not to let her anxiety show. When Judge Hawthorne returned, his expression was grave. "I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony," he said, "and I'm prepared to make my ruling. The plaintiff's claims of historical water rights are not supported by the documentation. The Spanish land grants in question referred to different properties and different water sources. Miss Emerson's deed clearly and legally includes water rights to the creek running through her property, as established by proper territorial survey and land office filing." Zara felt James's hand close over hers, squeezing tight. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am troubled by the pattern of incidents described by the defense. While I cannot make legal determinations about criminal acts in this civil proceeding, I am referring this matter to the Territorial Marshal's Office for investigation. The timing and nature of the property damage and intimidation Miss Emerson has experienced suggests possible criminal harassment." Pemberton's face had gone red, his jaw clenched tight. "Therefore, I rule in favor of the defendant, Miss Zara Emerson. Her water rights are affirmed as legal and legitimate. The plaintiff's challenge is dismissed. Furthermore, Mr. Pemberton, I am ordering you to pay Miss Emerson's legal fees and court costs. If you wish to pursue any further legal action regarding this property, be aware that I will view any such action as potential harassment and will not look upon it favorably." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and it was over. Zara sat frozen for a moment, unable to quite believe it. Then Connor was shaking her hand, congratulating her, and James was pulling her into a tight hug, and she realized they'd won. She'd won. Pemberton stormed out of the courtroom without a word, his lawyers trailing behind him. Duncan stopped briefly to speak with Connor, grudging respect in his voice as he acknowledged the defeat and arranged for the payment of fees. Outside the courthouse, in the bright Sacramento sunshine, Zara finally let herself breathe. "You did it," James said, his eyes shining. "You stood up to him and you won." "We did it," Zara corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you, without Connor." She turned to James's brother. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you for what you've done." "Be happy," Connor said simply. "Build a good life on that land you fought for. And take care of my little brother. That's payment enough." "I will," Zara promised, meeting James's eyes. "On both counts." They stayed in Sacramento one more night to celebrate, having dinner at a nice restaurant where Connor insisted on paying. The food was delicious and the wine was sweet, but what Zara enjoyed most was the conversation, the laughter, the sense of relief and joy that filled the evening. When Connor finally said goodnight and headed back to San Francisco, James walked Zara to her hotel room door. "So," he said, taking both her hands in his, "when we get back to the valley, can I officially begin courting you? Because I wasn't entirely joking about the flowers and dinners and romance." "I'd like that," Zara said, smiling. "Though I should warn you, I'm not very experienced with courting. I spent most of my life planning to stay independent." "We'll figure it out together," James said and kissed her softly. "That seems to be what we're good at." The ride back to Marysville felt different than the journey out, lighter, more hopeful. They talked about their plans for their properties, about James finishing his cabin, about Zara expanding her garden next spring. They talked about the future in a way that assumed they'd be in each other's lives, and it felt natural. When they finally rode back into the valley, both of them tired from travel but happy, they found something waiting for them. James's cabin had been finished. The roof repaired, new lumber stacked neatly beside the rebuilt shed, the whole structure looking solid and complete. A note was pinned to the door in handwriting Zara didn't recognize. "A neighbor helps neighbors. Good luck to you both." It was signed by a dozen names, other small homesteaders and farmers from the surrounding areas. People Zara had met in passing at the general store or at church services. People who'd heard about the court case, about Pemberton's harassment, and had decided to take a stand. James looked stunned, running his hand over the solid walls, examining the careful workmanship. "They did this while we were gone," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "All of them working together." "You're not the only one who believes in helping neighbors," Zara said softly. "You inspired them, James. By standing up for me, you showed them they could stand up too." That night they had dinner at Zara's cabin, but the mood was different now. There was an awareness between them, a tension that was equal parts exciting and terrifying. They'd confessed their feelings, they'd kissed, but they hadn't really talked about what came next. "Zara," James said after they'd finished eating and were sitting on the cabin steps watching the stars, "I meant what I said about courting you properly. I don't want to rush anything or make you uncomfortable. We can take this as slow as you need." "What if I don't want to take it slow?" Zara asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "What if I already know what I want?" James turned to look at her, his expression serious. "What do you want?" "You," Zara said simply. "A life with you, a partnership." "I spent so long thinking I had to do everything alone, that depending on anyone was weakness. But being with you doesn't feel like dependence, James. It feels like strength. Like we're better together than we could ever be apart." James cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. "I want that too, more than anything. But Zara, I need you to be sure. Marriage, partnership, it's a big step. I don't want you to feel like you're giving up your independence." "I'm not giving it up," Zara said. "I'm choosing to share it. With someone who respects it, who values it, who makes me want to build something bigger than just my own dreams." "Marry me then," James said, and his voice was shaking slightly. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few months, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Marry me, Zara. Let's build our future together, side by side." Zara felt tears slip down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." James kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Zara felt like her heart might burst from happiness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she laughed. "We're going to scandalize the whole town," she said. "Quick courtship, marrying before the year's out." "Let them talk," James said, grinning. "I've never cared much what people think anyway, and besides, frontier courtships are often quick. Life's too uncertain to waste time." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Marysville. Connor came back from San Francisco to stand up as James's best man. A woman named Sarah Chen, Billy's older sister who ran the restaurant with her parents, stood up as Zara's witness. The other small homesteaders who'd helped finish James's cabin came to the wedding, along with a surprising number of townspeople who'd heard about Zara's victory over Pemberton and wanted to show their support. Sheriff Morrison didn't attend, and neither did Pemberton, but Zara didn't care. She was surrounded by people who mattered, people who'd stood by her when it counted. She wore a simple dress of blue calico that she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers from the valley woven into her dark hair. James wore his best shirt and trousers, his boots polished until they shone, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the short aisle. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with such joy and tenderness that Zara forgot they had an audience. This was everything she'd thought she didn't want, and it turned out to be everything she needed. The celebration afterward was lively and warm, with food brought by their neighbors and music played on fiddles and guitars. They danced in the street as the sun set, Zara's hand in James's, both of them laughing and spinning until they were dizzy. That night, Zara moved her belongings to James's cabin, which would now be their cabin. It was strange and wonderful to share space with someone, to have another person's presence be a constant comfort rather than an intrusion. They stayed up late talking about their plans, about combining their two properties into one larger homestead, about the life they'd build together. "I want children someday," James said, his arm around her as they lay together. "If you do, a whole house full of them running wild and free in this valley." "I want that too," Zara said, surprised by how much she meant it. A year ago she'd thought children would trap her, tie her down. But with James, it felt different. Children would be something they created together, raised together, a legacy of the love they'd found. The first few months of their marriage were a period of adjustment and joy. They worked their combined land together, Zara teaching James the finer points of gardening while he showed her better techniques for managing livestock. They bought a small herd of cattle with the money Pemberton had been ordered to pay in legal fees, using his own resources against him to build their ranch. Pemberton himself had been notably quiet since the court case. There were no more incidents of harassment, no more threatening visits. Whether it was the judge's warning, the investigation by the territorial marshal, or simply the realization that the other small homesteaders had united against him, he'd apparently decided to leave them alone. The first real test of their marriage came that winter. The snows came early and heavy, blanketing the valley in white and making it difficult to care for their animals. Zara and James worked from dawn to dusk, hauling feed and breaking ice on the water troughs, making sure their cattle survived the cold. It was exhausting work, and there were days when tempers flared and they snapped at each other over small things. But they always talked it through, always apologized and worked to do better. Marriage, Zara learned, wasn't about never fighting. It was about fighting fair and always remembering you were on the same side. One particularly harsh night, when the wind howled and snow piled against the cabin walls, they huddled together under every blanket they owned, the fire in the hearth struggling against the cold. "This is harder than I expected," Zara admitted, her teeth chattering. "I knew ranching was difficult, but this is brutal." "We'll make it," James said, pulling her closer. "We've got shelter, food, each other. That's more than a lot of people have." "I know," Zara said. "I'm not complaining exactly, just acknowledging that this life isn't easy." "Would you trade it?" James asked. "Go back to the city to an easier life?" Zara thought about it seriously, then shook her head. "No, never. This is hard, but it's ours. We built it together. That means something." "It means everything," James agreed and kissed the top of her head. They survived that winter, and when spring came, bringing warmth and green growth back to the valley, Zara discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. She'd wanted children, but the reality of it was overwhelming. What if she wasn't a good mother? What if something went wrong? What if she couldn't handle the ranch work while pregnant? James, sensing her anxiety, wrapped her in his arms and held her close. "We'll figure it out," he said, and she heard the awe and excitement in his voice. "Together like everything else." "You're not scared?" Zara asked. "Terrified," James admitted with a laugh, "but also thrilled. We're going to be parents, Zara." We're going to raise a child in this beautiful valley, teach them to be strong and kind and brave. That's amazing." His enthusiasm was contagious, and Zara found her own excitement building. They spent the next few months preparing, building a cradle from pine wood, sewing tiny clothes, getting advice from the other women in the valley about what to expect. Sarah Chen became a good friend during this time, stopping by regularly to check on Zara and share stories about raising her own 2 children. She taught Zara practical things about childbirth and infant care, but more importantly, she provided companionship and support. "You're going to be a wonderful mother," Sarah said one afternoon as they sat shelling peas together. "I can see it in how you care for everything around you. Your garden, your animals, your husband. You have a nurturing spirit." "I hope you're right," Zara said, one hand resting on her growing belly. "I never had a mother to teach me these things. She died when I was 12. "Then you'll learn as you go," Sarah said gently. "That's what we all do, and you have people around you who care, who'll help. You're not alone in this." The baby came on a hot August evening in 1879, almost exactly a year after Zara and James had first met. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Zara thought she couldn't continue. But Sarah was there, coaching her through, and James never left her side, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. When the baby finally emerged, wailing lustily, Zara heard James's sharp intake of breath. "A boy," Sarah announced, wrapping the infant in clean cloth. "A healthy, strong boy." She placed the baby in Zara's arms, and Zara looked down at her son's red, wrinkled face with overwhelming love. He had dark hair like hers, but she could already see James's features in the shape of his nose and chin. "Hello," she whispered to him. "Hello, little one. We've been waiting for you." James leaned over, tears streaming down his face as he looked at their son. "He's perfect," he said hoarsely. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" They discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at her son, Zara knew. "Thomas," she said, "after my father. Thomas James Foster." "Thomas," James repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, Tommy. Welcome to the world, son." The first few months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Tommy was a healthy baby, but he required constant attention, constant feeding, constant care. Zara and James learned to function on minimal sleep, taking turns walking the floor with him when he cried at night, marveling at every tiny milestone. Watching James with their son filled Zara with a happiness she'd never imagined. He was patient and gentle, singing to Tommy in his low voice, carefully supporting his tiny head, learning to change diapers and give baths without complaint. He was a natural father, and seeing him in that role made Zara fall in love with him all over again. The ranch work became more challenging with an infant to care for, but they adapted. Zara learned to work with Tommy strapped to her back, continuing her garden work and chores while he dozed or watched the world with curious eyes. James took on more of the heavy labor, rising even earlier to get work done before the baby woke. Their neighbors rallied around them too, as they had so many times before. When James needed to drive their cattle to market in Sacramento, Sarah and her husband offered to help Zara with the ranch work and baby care. When Tommy got sick with croup that first winter, old Mrs. Patterson from town came out with remedies and sat up with Zara through the worst of it, teaching her how to ease his breathing. "This is what community means," Mrs. Patterson said as Tommy finally fell into peaceful sleep after days of struggling. "We take care of each other. Your man stood up for you against Pemberton, and in doing that, he stood up for all of us. Now we stand with you." Zara had tears in her eyes as she thanked the older woman. She'd come to California seeking independence, But what she'd found was something better: interdependence. A web of relationships and mutual support that made everyone stronger. Time passed, measured in seasons and milestones. Tommy learned to walk, then to run, his laughter echoing across the valley as he chased chickens and played in the creek. Zara and James expanded their ranch, adding more cattle, improving their cabin, building a proper barn. The land they'd fought so hard to keep became prosperous, proof that their determination and hard work had been worthwhile. When Tommy was 3, Zara became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect, and in the spring of 1882 she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Emma Rose, and she had her father's blue eyes and sunny disposition. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family, hardship and joy. There were difficult times, droughts that tested their resources, harsh winters that took a toll on their livestock, the normal struggles of frontier ranching. But there were far more good times. Harvest celebrations with their neighbors, Christmas gatherings where Tommy and Emma hung stockings sewn from scraps, quiet evenings as a family around the fire. Pemberton remained a distant presence, his vast ranch still surrounding their property on most sides, but he never directly threatened them again. There was an unspoken truce between them, a mutual acknowledgement that Zara and James weren't going anywhere, and that further attempts to drive them off would only bring more trouble. On their 5th wedding anniversary, James took Zara up to the ridge overlooking both their properties, the place where he'd first camped to protect her. "Remember when I set up my bedroll right here?" he asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the sunset paint the valley in gold and orange. "I remember," Zara said, leaning into him. "I remember being scared and alone and thinking I'd have to fight Pemberton by myself." "You were never alone," James said. "Even before I knew you, even before I understood what you were facing, I knew you were someone special. Someone worth standing beside. You changed my life," Zara said quietly. "I had this rigid idea of what independence meant, what strength looked like. I thought I had to do everything myself or I was weak. But you taught me that real strength is knowing when to accept help, when to lean on someone you trust. You taught me that love and partnership don't diminish independence, they enhance it." James turned her to face him, his expression tender. "You taught me a few things too. About courage and determination, about standing up for what's right even when it's hard, about what it means to truly respect and value another person." He paused, then smiled. "And about how to make bread that doesn't double as a weapon." Zara laughed, swatting his arm playfully. "Your bread is perfectly fine now. Thanks to you." James kissed her softly. "Everything good in my life is thanks to you." They stood there as the sun disappeared beyond the hills, holding each other, watching their land darken into evening. Down below, they could see their cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, could imagine their children inside with Sarah, who was watching them for the evening. This was what they'd fought for. Not just the land itself, but the life they'd built on it. The family they'd created, the community they'd become part of, the future they were shaping together. "You ever miss how things were before?" James asked. "The excitement of those early days, standing up to Pemberton, fighting for your claim." Zara thought about it seriously. Those days had been intense, filled with fear and adrenaline and the sharp awareness that everything could be lost in a moment. But they'd also been lonely, uncertain, exhausting in ways that went beyond physical labor. "No," she said finally. "I wouldn't trade what we have now for anything. This is better. This is real." "Yeah," James agreed, pulling her closer. "This is real." As the years continued to pass, their children grew and the ranch prospered. Tommy developed a gift for working with horses, training them with patience and skill. Emma showed her mother's talent for growing things, tending an ever-expanding garden with care and creativity. When Tommy turned 12, he started helping his father with the cattle drives to Sacramento. When Emma was 10, she began selling vegetables and preserves in town, saving the money for her own future dreams. Zara and James grew older together, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their bodies marked by the hard labor of ranch life. But they were happy. Deeply, thoroughly happy in a way that came from building something meaningful together. One evening when Tommy was 16 and Emma was 13, both of them competent enough to manage the ranch for a few days, James surprised Zara with a trip. "Where are we going?" she asked as they rode west, leaving the valley behind. "You'll see," James said mysteriously. They traveled for a full day, staying overnight at a small inn, then continuing west until Zara began to recognize landmarks. They were heading toward the coast. When they finally crested the last hill and the Pacific Ocean spread out before them, vast and blue and endless, Zara gasped. "You remembered," she said, tears pricking her eyes. "You told me you'd seen it once," James said, dismounting and helping her down. "I wanted to see it with you. I wanted to share that." They spent 2 days at the coast, walking along the beach, collecting shells, watching the waves crash against the rocks. It was a gift beyond price, this time together away from the responsibilities of the ranch, away from everything except each other. On their last evening, sitting on the sand and watching the sunset over the ocean, James took her hand. "I love you," he said simply. "I've loved you since the day you refused to back down to Pemberton. I'll love you until my last breath. I want you to know that." "I know," Zara said, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you too, more than I ever thought I could love anyone. You're my partner, my best friend, my everything." They kissed as the sun touched the horizon, the sound of the waves a constant rhythm around them. This was peace. This was happiness. This was the life they'd built from determination and courage and love. When they returned to the ranch, they found everything running smoothly under Tommy and Emma's capable management. Their children were growing up, becoming independent, preparing to make their own marks on the world. Tommy talked about starting his own horse training business. Emma dreamed of opening a shop in Marysville, selling her preserves and baked goods. "They're going to leave eventually," Zara said to James one night after the children had gone to bed. "Build their own lives." "That's how it should be," James said, though she heard the bittersweetness in his voice. "We raised them to be strong and capable. Now we have to let them use those gifts." "I know," Zara said. "It's just strange to think about, this ranch, this life. It's been about family for so long." "What will we do when it's just the two of us again?" James smiled. "Whatever we want. We'll still have the ranch to run, but we'll also have time for each other. Time to take more trips, to visit Connor in San Francisco, to do all the things we've put off while raising children." "It's not an ending, Zara. It's a new beginning." He was right, as he so often was. When Tommy eventually married a sweet young woman named Rachel from a neighboring ranch and started his horse training business on land they helped him purchase, it wasn't a loss. It was a joy, seeing their son happy and settled. When Emma opened her shop in town and made a success of it, they were proud of her independence and business sense. And Zara and James did indeed find new rhythms to their life together. They took more trips, traveling to San Francisco to visit Connor and his family, exploring parts of California they'd never seen. They became the elder generation, the wise voices their children and eventually their grandchildren came to for advice and stories. The valley changed over the years. More settlers arrived. The town of Marysville grew, roads improved and modernized. But the fundamental character of the place remained the same, a community of people who looked out for each other, who understood the value of hard work and mutual support. Pemberton grew old and eventually died, his vast ranch divided among squabbling relatives who didn't have his drive or ruthlessness. Much of his land was sold off to smaller ranchers and farmers, the empire he tried so hard to build fragmenting within a generation. It felt like justice of a sort, though by that time, Zara found she no longer cared much about old grievances. She'd won what mattered: her land, her family, her life on her own terms. On a warm summer evening in 1905, Zara and James sat on their porch watching the sunset, as they had thousands of times before. They were in their late 60s now, their children grown and successful, their grandchildren running wild in the valley just as Tommy and Emma once had. The ranch was still theirs, still productive, though these days they had hired hands to do much of the heavy work. "You remember the day we met?" Zara asked, her hand in James's as it had been for nearly 30 years. "Every detail," James said. "You were hauling water from the creek. I'd just ridden over the ridge to introduce myself. You looked at me with such suspicion." "Can you blame me?" Zara laughed. "For all I knew, you were another one of Pemberton's men." "Instead, I was just a cowboy looking for a place to call home," James said, "and finding so much more than that." "We both found more than we expected," Zara agreed. She looked out at the land they'd fought for, built on, raised a family on. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, that all of this happened because I was stubborn enough to stand up for myself." "You were brave enough," James corrected. "And I'm grateful every day that I had the privilege of standing beside you." Zara turned to look at her husband, at the lines around his eyes and the gray in his hair, at the familiar face she'd woken up next to for decades. He was still the most handsome man she'd ever seen, still the person she wanted to talk to about everything, still her best friend and greatest love. "I love you, James Foster," she said. "I love you, Zara Foster," he replied, and kissed her as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and red. They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged, holding hands and watching their land settle into night. Somewhere in the valley, a coyote called, and from the barn came the soft sounds of horses settling in for sleep. The creek that Zara had fought so hard to keep flowed on, its constant murmur a reminder of everything they'd overcome. This was their legacy. Not just the land or the ranch or even the children they'd raised, but the proof that courage and love could overcome any obstacle. That standing up for yourself was worth the risk. That finding someone to stand beside you could change everything. As Zara leaned her head on James's shoulder, she felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for the landowner who tried to run her off and inadvertently set everything in motion. Gratitude for the cowboy who'd moved in beside her and changed her life forever. Gratitude for every hardship that had taught her she was stronger than she knew, and every joy that had shown her what life could be. This was the happily ever after she'd never thought to dream of, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. Not because it was perfect or easy, but because it was real, because it was earned, because it was hers. And as the night deepened around them and James's hand stayed warm in hers, Zara knew that this was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she was meant to be with, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The end.